Yay. So welcome to the UU Women's Federation Part 1 series of addressing gender-based violence. My name is Antoinette Scully. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm an organizer here with the UU Women's Federation. We wanted to give a little bit of context and introduce our guest, as well as some of the work that we've been doing at the Women's Federation. I also want to throw it to my partner in crime, Candace, who also is an organizer here. You may introduce yourself, Candace.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight on this Thursday. We really appreciate you all wanting to be in community with us as we have this really powerful conversation. I'm just going to do some brief introductions of who we have on the panel, on the call right now. We have Reverend Casey Slack. They use their pronouns they and them. They are the senior clergy leader at the Washington Ethical Society in Washington, D.C. Their work as a clergy person, chaplain, academic, and artist is grounded in embodied practice and focus on finding and building beauty into the future. They moved from Los Angeles last summer, and they now live and sing loudly with their wife and 3 cats in Southeast DC. I love that bio. It sums it up really well. And then we also have Reverend Leah. Can you help me pronounce your last name for me? Shinya?
Leela Sinha.
Sinha. Leela Sinha. Okay, wait, let me get back to me. Okay, yeah. Leela Sinha is a brown queer gender and entrepreneur community ministry with theology of pleasure and a habit of transformative mischievous. In their work, Z offers leadership coaching, training, keynotes, working with leaders and organizations to develop and delight in the power and intensity we have and to use that power for good. They use their pronouns Z, Zim, and Zir. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm really excited for this engaging conversation. We will have a time later on for questions. So feel free to table your questions on the side and we will open it up to engage with everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So I'd like to give a short agenda. We'll do our welcoming, our chalice lighting. We've done our introductions. We have a couple of questions for the panelists themselves. We'll open it up for everyone else to have questions, and then we will have our announcements and closing words. So if you've been with us before, this is a very standard UU Women's Federation agenda, and I think they make it pretty easy for everyone to enjoy and involve. So I have a chalice. If you have a chalice at your home, feel free to light your own chalice. But I wanted to do a short chalice reading, and our opening words are from Pamela Ruenick. So I might not have said her name properly, but this is why community? Why community to remember that one is not a whole number, that we need both roots and wings, that strength comes from relationship and mutuality, and that we know life in and through one another. So now we'll get to the most exciting part of our panel discussion, which is actually to ask our panelists some questions. And I am going to start with a little bit of a context in us, and then I will throw it to Candace and you can ask the first question. Sounds good?
Yes.
Awesome. If my computer allows me to. Okay. So the UU Women's Federation believes that building relationships is the most effective way to create positive cultural change. This idea came out of the understanding that much of the violence against women starts with gender inequality, the disrespect of women, and the disregard of women's bodily autonomy. So when we see disrespect as violence, we also see it morph into the physical, mental, and sexual abuse that happens to women and girls across the country. I wanted to give you a couple of statistics and kinds of things that come with talking about violence against women. And so this comes from the National Organization for Women, that domestic violence, or intimate partner violence is another way to put it, is so high that it counts for 30 or 40% of violence towards women. And that most of the violence towards women that we speak on, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's intimate partner violence, is typically geared towards younger women. And so ages 24 and younger see the highest forms of rape. Women ages 20 to 24 are at greater risk of non-fatal domestic violence, and the impact on children is astounding. And so as I kind of put some of the questions that we have in context to some of this, know that we are all working together to make these numbers smaller and smaller, but some of us are experts in this and some of us are not, and that we lend our voices to this conversation with care. And so I know that we introduced the panelists from their bios that they gave us, but we want to know from their perspective who they are and the work that they do. And so I will start with Reverend Leva and ask them what them do. I know I'm going to try really hard not to mess that up all night. And then we'll move to Reverend Casey Slack.
I really appreciate you trying. And, I think that incorporating neopronouns into our vocabularies is a process. So I think it's really important to make spaces for us to try and mess it up and try again, because otherwise we get stuck on one side or the other of that process. So my name is Leela Sinha. I was ordained in 2006. I was originally in parish ministry, and then after about 4 years in parish ministry, I left the parish and moved kind of gently into community ministry, where I now locate my entrepreneurial community ministry. So I bring Unitarian Universalist values into the startup world, into the business world, and also carry them in my consulting work with our congregations and organizations. Right now, I am also the interim director for Trust, which is the Trans UU Religious Professionals Organization, and that has been a beautiful journey. We are coming to the end of our time together, but that's been a huge part of my work this year. And I also sometimes work one-on-one with colleagues, coaching colleagues, or with clergy colleagues, or with other folks who are in leadership positions, to help them make their spaces a better place to work for themselves and for everyone else. I don't know what other questions I missed. I'm terrible at retaining them long enough to answer them.
Reverend Casey Slack. I got ordained in 2018, so rather more recently. And I've been working in the parish for 5 years. So I started my first parish position right after I got ordained. I started at a small congregation in Northeast Los Angeles County, and then just for the past year have been the senior clergy leader at the Washington Ethical Society, which is a congregation that holds dual affiliation with the Unitarian Universalist Association and the American Ethical Union. The American Ethical Union is another liberal religious organization, but it's religious humanism more directly than Unitarian Universalism is. So I work currently in humanistic spaces as a witch and artist, kind of bringing a little bit of magic into those spaces. My background before ministry, directly before ministry, is in abortion care. So I came to ministry from a couple of years of work as a patient advocate at Preterm in Cleveland, Ohio, which is still the largest abortion provider in Ohio. They're fighting every day to continue to provide that reproductive care. So my connection to some of the conversation we'll have today also is really attached to my commitment to reproductive justice, my commitment to bodily autonomy, and everybody's individual ability to flourish under their own guidance.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Candace.
Yes. So as you all may or may not know, the UUWF has 4 priority issues that intertwine in a variety of ways. What we used to call stopping domestic violence, we have now changed to protecting women. The priority issue looks at keeping women safe. This is explicit towards cis and trans women. What is not as explicit is our commitment to include non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming people, and gender-expansive people. We try as often as we can to include when we talk about us. How can we be more inclusive with our actions and language and still stand firmly in prioritizing women as our focus? Have you seen any other women's group do this well or poorly? That's one other question. And I believe it's open to anyone who would like to answer. So I know I said a lot at the beginning. But the question is, how can we be more inclusive in our actions and language and still stand firmly in prioritizing women as our focus? And have you seen anybody else do this as an example fairly well or fairly poor?
I think I've seen a lot of organizations do it poorly. I think I've seen a lot more examples of it being done in a way that makes it clear that an expansive definition of womanhood isn't being used in the first place, and an understanding of non-binary identity isn't actually present. I often find this, the short way people will often say this is they will just say, oh, women and femmes, but they don't actually mean women and femmes. Like when you get into the space, you find that, oh, that's not what you mean. For example, I used to be very identified as a femme, and I now have a much more complicated relationship with that word as a trans masculine person who is doing everything from kind of the wrong angle. But a space that would bring me in as someone they think of as a femme, but wouldn't a person assigned male at birth who has a similar presentation to me. Okay, that you're doing some essentializing that's really uncomfortable. Sometimes women and femmes gets used as a catch-all for something it isn't a catch-all for, right? The category femmes also includes some number of people who are men, and not just people who are trans men. Some number of cisgender men are femme in their presentation. One of the things that I think happens here is that the language of femme and masc, which are queer languages and queer gender spaces, get put out into the world without their full context. And if you hear femme and you have lived in a straight cisgender world and your conception of femme is feminine rather than the really complicated, vast thing that femme is, you might think that femme is a stand-in word for somebody who likes dresses or somebody who was assigned female at birth, but it's really about an approach to presentation that is decorative and taking on a particular type of artistic power. And so I think sometimes because language has not been transmitted in its fullness, because it's really easy to mistranslate somebody else's language, this gets turned into something very, very strange. I will say also that you see sometimes organizations try to be inclusive and they say women and non-binary people, and what they mean is people with vaginas. And that's a people with vaginas is a coherent category of people who have actual material interests in common, but it's not the same as women and non-binary people. And I'll let Reverend Leela speak.
I want to thank you for bringing in that queerness of the word femme, because it is such a complex identity, and it's challenging when organizations that don't necessarily know, or individuals who don't necessarily understand that queerness, try to use it as some kind of shorthand for something else that isn't the full complex queer femme identity, because it carries that. And I'm using the word queer even though I know that some people don't identify with queer. I'm using the word queer specifically because it implies a certain social and political location, and femme has, as far back as at least 1992 when I came out, and I believe before that, has always had, no, I guess I came out in 94, but has always had that very queering influence. And you can't, I don't think that it's accurately used if that's not what you're trying to include and imply. So yes, I've seen a lot of organizations trip over some of the things that Reverend Casey just spoke to. And also, when I have seen organizations address it more deeply, what happens is the categories of gender fall apart. And that can be extremely challenging for an organization that is organized around a gender identity. So, for example, if we said people with vaginas, now we're including a lot of trans men who identify as men, who outside of who in their clothes look like men to people who, are trying to make those kinds of categorizations. But the minute you start to think harder about gender, most organizations are no longer able to be organized around gender. And so that's a very challenging space, and it can be very hard on everyone, but it can also not really lift up. But like the image I have is of like a geyser coming up, like it comes up by itself. It can rise, cause to arise some really useful transformations that then shift how organizations understand themselves in the gendered space.
Thank you. We wanted to start with that question simply because we know that there is this tension, even in this space today, that is talking about protecting women, and starting our series with gender expansive, non-binary, genderqueer voices. But I wanted to make it very clear that the reason that gender expansive people are not outside of the process of having to be a protected group of people, because women are abused due to gender inequality. And so when we are all under the gender inequality system, then we are all harmed in some capacity. And I really appreciate y'all and the responses to this very nuanced question as we start. And my next question is, like, to be clear, violence against women and gender expansive people is a systemic issue, right? Like, we by ourselves cannot individually fight this away. However, in the work that we do, what are some of the ways you have created safe structures in your ministry for safety and security for people in these protected groups? And I'll let Reverend Leela start, and we'll go to Reverend Casey.
I think one of the interesting things about my ministry as it is now is that I'm mostly not operating in groups that are necessarily gathered around specifically values or religious beliefs. And that's really different from when I was operating mostly in congregational spaces. So for me, a lot of the work that I do to create more safety and reduce violence in my ministry is in my public presence, in the way that I choose my language when I exist in the world. As my entire life, there have been things about my existence that have been political or politicized, and so part of my ministry in the world has always been existing publicly. But the language that I use around that, how I'm careful about it. I just had a conversation the other day with somebody who is running a program for women, a group program for women. And ordinarily I cross promote with all of my coaching colleagues. And I said to her, I can't promote your, and I said this on our podcast interview. I don't know if she's going to take it out, but I said, I can't publicly promote your program unless I have a good solid answer to why is it only for women? Because if it's for people who have a particular set of experiences, the odds are good that it includes a lot of transmasculine people. And that, in fact, sometimes those conversations are more active in transmasculine spaces because it's so glaringly obvious that we are, as transmasculine people, moving away from whatever we were taught to be as girls and women. And so we have to be in conversation with that. And we have to be in conversation with what is a response to toxicity, masculine, male toxicity, masculine toxicity. How do we choose to become more masculine in ways that don't reinforce that, in ways that don't support that? How do we constantly interrogate our presence, especially like I co-moderate a large transmasculine Discord, and the conversations in there are largely about how to go through this process of re-becoming. And part of that is, how do we reduce the violence that is implied by certain kinds of presentation in the world? How do we either not imply that through the way that we present, or if we're going to present that way and that's going to carry those implications, how do we change our behavior so that we don't reinforce that? So it's a very like tightly examined way. And that volunteer position is another piece of my ministry, is another piece of how I help to create space in the world. So I don't have like we made a policy in the church kind of answer for this. It's so integrated, and it's, again, so nuanced. And when we try to create safer spaces, I come back to the language of sexuality around the AIDS crisis, because it's the same. It's like, I can make it safer. I can work really hard to create structures and covenants of behavior. I can work really hard with my co-moderating teams and my other leadership people to make sure that there are structures for how we can address violence when it starts to emerge, so that we don't end up with what they call a missing stair. Somebody who's known to be a problem in the community, but nobody can really address, so they just step around it all the time. And it's all this little structural stuff. It's like all these little filaments.
In the congregational space, there's sort of a pat answer, and I'm gonna give you that, and then I'm gonna give you some more stuff, because in the congregational space, in what I tend to call UU land, we have some relatively good policy habits, right? It is relatively normal in the congregations that I've served and in the congregations I've worked in other contexts, for there to be a safer congregation policy, for there to be a disruptive behavior policy, for there to be a pretty comprehensive sexual harassment policy. And these are all great, and if your congregation does not have them, they absolutely should. But they're also not quite enough, right? We can't actually policy our way around what are cultural problems. We can't individual our way around systemic problems. We can't policy our way around cultural problems. We've got to address things from a number of directions at once. And so I think of my approach as a congregational minister to dealing with the realities of gender-based violence in kind of two broad categories. One being direct conversation, speaking directly about the realities of gender-based violence, and not just about the statistics, which are harrowing every time I see them, but speaking directly about misogyny. One thing that can be kind of a missing stair of its own in progressive, liberal, whatever we want to think of ourselves as communities is this idea that we've like dealt with misogyny and we're on to new problems, when absolutely that is not the case. So you find over and over again UU spaces, progressive spaces where maybe most of the people on the board are women. And so the men in the congregation or the men in the space will say, oh, well, everybody in charge is a woman, so we have no misogyny problem here. But then you watch people behave and you notice that even though the board president is a woman, her ideas are not given the same kind of value in a conversation as some guy. You notice that even in congregations where you have a history of women in leadership, people will refer back to a man who was the minister years ago in a way that they do not to a woman who was the minister 2 years ago. So direct conversation and naming that is misogyny, and that is misogyny that we still have in our systems, in our culture, in ourselves. I do in my own self a lot of what Reverend Leila was mentioning about, okay, what does it mean to move into masculinity? What does it mean to operate in a less feminized but still perceived as a woman space, which is weird. But it gives me some extra perspective on who is saying what and how they are saying it, and who is taking up space and whether they are paying attention to that they are taking up space at all. And you can notice, walk through an airport or a crowded anywhere sometime and notice who knows that your body is there and who doesn't. And people who don't notice that your body is there are people who will tend to have more bigoted views broadly, whether they know about them or not. You can go into a congregational space and have the same experience of someone walking directly into you as you might have in all kinds of spaces in the airport, because your ability to pay attention to where your physical body is and your ability to pay attention to where your emotional body is are related concepts. And when we can talk directly about that as misogyny, as a bigoted behavior, that helps bring it to a level of intensity and importance that lets us address it for real. Because it is really easy to be like, oh, well, he's just like that, or he's from another time. Well, he lives here and now and has to be in community with the rest of us. It also helps to be able to name it, because internalized misogyny is a real intense experience, right? There are a lot of us is a weird word there, we're going to leave that aside. A lot of people who are women, or who were raised as women, or who have experience of being perceived as women, who learned to hate the things that marked us as women, and learned to hate it in ourselves and in other people. And you see this in a clear way in what I think of as and what people often talk about as femphobia, a distaste for things that are overly feminine, right? So I think the Barbie movie was a really great public exhibit of that. The number of people who thought that was going to be a fluffy, silly, pointless movie, or who couldn't see past their belief about what a lot of pink means to the depth of that movie, right? Who, because it's a women's thing, it is necessarily unserious. You also see it, one of the ways you see it most clearly in congregational settings is in the way that women and more feminine people's dress is really, really paid attention to. Do you wear makeup? How much makeup do you wear? Whatever choice you made was probably wrong. Do you wear dresses? Are they too pretty? Are they not pretty enough? Are they serious enough? I don't know how many times I've heard my colleagues who are women get feedback from people in their congregations, including other women, about, you know, you dress in a way that makes it hard for me to take you seriously. That thing is misogyny. It is also probably classism and a number of other things, but it is notably misogyny. The other piece that I wanted to talk about is bodily autonomy. Because if you put bodily autonomy in the middle, everybody's right to conduct their own personal body as they see fit, you start to dissolve some of the foundations of misogyny in the first place, right? Some of the foundations of sexism and gender-based violence, which are about the idea that somebody else should be in control of your body. If everybody has bodily autonomy, and if we focus on that, everybody is exactly one person and gets the rights of exactly one person, which include full control of personal body, personal meat suit, however you want to put it, right? That really gets to some of the bare bones stuff about misogyny and gender-based oppression. It is really easy to say to a person, you can't touch somebody else unless they say it said yes, if you have a core belief in bodily autonomy. It's very hard to think that you're allowed to do violence to someone else's body if you really believe that they have a right to their own person. So those are two of the ways that I try to address that in my work in general and in the congregational space. It's being really, really clear about misogyny existing and really, really clear about the value, the core value of bodily autonomy.
Can I just piggyback a little bit on the last thing that you said? So, in addition to having like the right to conduct one's own body, the corollary piece to that for me is, if you have the right to conduct your body the way you want, that means that other people don't get to judge it. And that cracks open a whole second layer of like the tools of perpetuation of violence against women, feminine presenting people, the tools of the patriarchy. Like, it's extraordinary how much deciding whether or not somebody should have dressed like that, or somebody's body shape should be like that, or somebody's hair should be like that. It's amazing how much when you take away that, you're left without tools, with a lot of the tools of violence.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to skip around a little bit, Candace, and I want to kind of expand a little bit on this piece of misogyny, and kind of move it also into the realm of the way in which women's bodies have been attacked over the past couple of years, and the way that trans people's bodies have been attacked. And I wanted to know if you can draw some correlating steps into like the laws that are coming down into both of these types of things, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and then the expansion of anti-trans laws happening across the US.
Yeah, and I think that goes pretty directly back into the bodily autonomy piece. So the bigger project, right? Attacks on abortion access and attacks on transgender healthcare are pieces of one project, not just in that they are a right-wing project, but in they are fundamentally about control of reproduction, and who gets to be in charge of people's bodies and people's capacity for or desire to reproduce. It is entirely, okay, it has some details that are not, but its ground is about, it is required that you do with your body what they believe, and truly they believe, some of them, that God said that if you have a penis, it's so you can get people pregnant, and if you have a vagina, it's so you can become pregnant. And so when we think of these as one thing, right, as two arms of the same attack, there is no conflict. between them. And there is no conflict between a trans woman's need for gender affirming healthcare and a cis woman's need for abortion access. There's no, the value in each is the same, because the value is that you are responsible for and endowed by whomever with the right to say what your body is for. So these are really attacks that focus on making you use your body a way somebody else wants you to, making you live your life a way somebody else wants you to. Transmisogyny, which is mentioned in the comments in a way that I think is really important to bring into the conversation. Transmisogyny is a big problem in UU spaces. It is notable that most of the trans ministers who you have heard of are transmasculine. There are many more transmasculine white people, to be perfectly honest, than there are trans women of any race in our movement. And that's for a reason. We are much harder on trans women as a society, as communities, than we are on transmasculine people. There's a bunch of reasons for that, but I just want to put that there. Trans women experience misogyny. Transmisogyny points to a combination of transphobia and misogyny, not to just some special other thing, though it is also some special, horrible other thing, but to a combination, right? It is misogyny when somebody tells you that because you have a uterus that works, your job is to make babies. And it is also misogyny when somebody tells you that because you were born with a penis, you can't experience womanhood as a social experience. I no longer experience womanhood as an inside experience, but I experience it as an outside experience. Gender works a bunch of ways, right? I have gender on the inside, which I project out, but society also projects gender in onto me. And so this whole project of denying abortion rights, of reducing access to maternal health care, actually, of transmisogyny in public, and of a anti-trans conversation very, very focused on trans women, is about recreating a gender-based hierarchy that we have done some but not all of the work at tearing apart over the last 60, 70 years. They are so linked as to be almost indistinguishable to me. And I think when we focus on responding from a place where we're not thinking about these as two really disparate issues that very different people have, but issues of women determining their own lives, of people determining their own lives, right? Because some number of people who need abortions are not women, and some number of people who need trans healthcare are not trans women. But in both cases, the focal point is women, because it is easy to convince people that you should control women, because there are centuries of belief that lead you to that. And because as a society, if we think men are necessarily better than women, we have this thing where we think it makes sense for a woman to want to be a man, because that is a raise in status. And we think that it is weird if a man wants to be a woman. Please forgive the way that I have framed that there. I'm framing it like the people who would say it would, not like I believe. But it is thought of as weird because that is a degradation in status. But reality is that this is all just people trying to be in control of their own lives.
Yes. And I'm thinking about the ways in which all society tends to see all of the people that you just mentioned as women, right? They see trans men as women. They see trans masculine people as women. And then they see trans women as women, complicated women, but enough women that they're worthy of that second class status. And so, and when you were talking about the ways in which this is about producing babies, I was like, this is literally them trying to seize the means of production. And not in a good way. Like usually we think of that as a progressive statement, but in this case, someone else is trying to seize the literally inherent means of production, even if that person doesn't want to be used as a means of production for themselves or for society, for whomever. So I absolutely concur that this legislative push is part of a larger project. I mean, it's not something you have to concur with, like it's fact, but it's part of a larger project that's been afoot since, was it the early 80s? That social and political conservatives, religious conservatives started to really push to take over the political spaces in the United States and to drive these agendas forward. So I was born in 1975. This has been going on most of my adult life. Well, all of my adult life, most of my life, period. And so when we look at, when we engage with this project from our side, we have to be willing to see it in its wholeness, to understand it in its wholeness, and dismantle it in its wholeness. Because this is a table with not just 2 legs or 3 legs. This is a table with, it's like a millipede table. And we have to be, if we want this table to come down, we have to be taking out all of the legs pretty much at once before they can regenerate, before they can find another tactic or another angle. And the problem is that the political agenda leaks into the social agenda, and the social agenda leaks into the political. So it's not just that this agenda is in the political arena, it's also that it comes into our congregations, it comes into advertising, it comes in everywhere. When I was growing up in the 70s, I remember all these ad campaigns that were like, boys and girls are equal and should have equal things. And by the mid 80s, it was like everything should be pink and blue is only for boys and pink is only for girls. And my, second wave feminist mother was like, what on earth? What on earth? She wouldn't buy me any representative toys. I only had Tinker toys and Legos and bristle blocks, because anything, and we didn't have kits, no Lego kits, just blocks, because that was a way to get around that.
Yeah, we really appreciate all that insight into how you can really take a hold of resisting what is normal and what is taught to us. So I really want to take a shift in conversation and really kind of think about how can art and creative spaces further push the cultural changes around gender in a more of a positive and inclusive direction. I really see art as music, painting, film, as a way to subvert what is normal to us in a way that is very digestible to many people. So how do you all think in your own experience or in your own likeness that art and creative outlets can really help like shift culture in a different way?
Art is the way that we help people imagine things. So if we want to imagine a world that is beyond violence against women, or that doesn't imagine a world that can't even conceive of violence against women, that can't even conceive of gender-based violence, that can't even conceive of trans misogyny or transphobia or any of these things that we've been talking about. Like, if we want to imagine those, what we have at our disposal is the ability to create forward, to create worlds and images and collections of experiences and emotions that take us out of where we are now into someplace else. And the classic place to think about this, of course, is speculative fiction, but I think there's so much more than that. I'm listening right now to a podcast series by Tara McMullen called, she has a podcast called What Works. And within that, she's doing a series about how speculative fiction can be used to imagine a different kind of work environment.
Mhm.
And I think that's just one piece of it. We could imagine a different kind of religious environment. We could imagine a different kind of relational environment, and we can do that. We can conceive of those things internally and in conversation and in community, and then we can begin to reify them by creating the image or the shape of them in our art.
Yes. I really appreciate that response, Reverend Leela. My mom used to always tell me when I read books was that when you read a book, your body's able to imagine what you want to see. But when you watch television, as opposed to watching television, it's like they're giving you what you should imagine. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that really ties in really well to how art is allowing us to imagine what we want to envision. I like that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Reverend Casey.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Yeah, I really agree with that. And I might go even another step further than art lets us imagine. I think art and that imagining gives us our humanity back, or gives us a path to getting our humanity back. Because these systems of domination and oppression, misogyny, racism, transphobia, et cetera, they pull us away from what it means to be a person. They pull us away from connection and all of the things that are really most holy. And I personally really love non-representational art. All of my favorite paintings, for example, are visibly of nothing, right? I like color field painting. The work that I do myself is abstract expressionist. And one of the things that I love about art is the emotional experience of it, and the way that you can feel into something different. Imagine, to me, sometimes gets very, let's like find out the particulars, and that's really important too. But for me, before I can imagine the particulars, I have to have a feeling that I can follow. And I think what I'd like to encourage is to imagine your life as an art project. So imagine your living as a creative project of collaboratively telling some kind of new story. So it's gonna sound sort of off to the side for a second, but I think you'll follow me. When I was a chaplain resident, I still had a pixie cut, and my hair was kind of this bright blue that it is over here. And I was walking down the hallway, and there was a group of family outside of a patient's room, and they said, "Is there a religious significance to the color of your hair?" They were reacting to the combination of the chaplain name tag and bright blue hair, which is not something they had ever seen before. And I said yes and walked away because I wasn't really in a space to have a conversation. But as I thought about it, the answer actually was yes. Because my hair, how I dress, what I wear is one of the ways that I choose to make art in public. One of the ways that I choose to show people that you can be something a little more out of the box. This is a little more intense an experience in Washington, D.C. than it was in Los Angeles. I keep saying that this is the grayest town that I have ever seen in my life. And my wife and I, who are both brightly colored people, make a different kind of wedge in this space. I made a different kind of wedge in the hospital space with bright blue hair and a chaplain badge on. And we're all able to do, you don't have to dye your hair, you don't have to wear anything other than what you like, but we're all able to do things that make art in public, that are creative acts of behaving, that are counter to the world as we've been handed it, and that let us open up our imaginations and other people's imaginations to see, wow, you really could do all kinds of things. You really could be all kinds of things. One of the ways that I see myself and my ministry as divorced from any institution, right? The ministry of my life is to show people that it's possible to be something that you never imagined before. That the things that happened yesterday don't have to be the things that happen tomorrow, that you can, in fact, wake up one day and decide that what you want to do is paint your eyebrows blue or be really nice to someone who people are generally ready to toss aside. That you can live in a way that paints the world in new colors. So I think art and music give us this opportunity to connect emotionally. And I think that making art is something we need to unbox from the idea of doing it right or making it look like something someone's already seen, or even from the idea of art is painting and music and writing, because art is also living. Life is also art.
I also wanted to give Reverend Lee, like, this is my kind of last question, and then we'll open it to more people. And it's just the continuation of this creating your reality. I'm a really big proponent of building the world I want. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, and I think I want to bring it home to this kind of like, as we move forward, you know, if we are able to give the people on this call, anybody who watches this in a replay, that I'm going to be forward and be that kind of abolitionist visioning, but that's not really what I mean. What I mean is just like the world we want to see in the future. What does that look like for y'all? And how can we give that kind of visioning to people in our spaces as we move forward?
What does it look like to create a space for visioning? Can you restate the question for me?
Yeah, not only to create the space, but to also help people envision as they move forward. So I know earlier you talked a little bit about just existing for you gives people that space to envision. And I know that Reverend Casey spoke a little bit about how being explicit in the naming of what harms us gives us space for that. And I think that people see that as a very like, this is what we're doing now. And if we did that, if we continue to do that, what kind of spaces are we creating for our future?
I don't think we can know. I think that people are complicated and unpredictable, and the world is complicated and unpredictable. And also, I think as we, it's like the Parker Palmer quote of "Take one step and way will open." You know, we cannot know what 65 steps down the road looks like, but we can know that we are compelled by our beliefs, by our faith, by our tradition to take those first, to make those first moves, to move those first couple of feet or inches down the path. And as we do that, as we work our way into each little bit, as we increment our way into it, things will become possible that we could not imagine at the beginning of the path. And I think one of the things that's beautiful is that when people individually or organizations collectively or societies embark on this work, often we desperately need something that we don't know exists. And so we begin by saying, well, you know, I teach a gender inclusion workshop. I recorded it, so now I also just sell it. But it's, you know, we start with like, well, okay, so we know that this model isn't working. And then once we get through this model isn't working, then we have to know, well, what are some of the ways it's not working? And then we have to know what are some of the possibilities outside of what we've been doing. And then we have to know what happens if we implement those. What happens if we start to imagine this or think about this or shape this in a different way? And by that time, you know, it's like a kid sitting there with an entire lap full of flowers. And then it's like, you didn't even know you were making bouquet, but here we are. So the world that I dream of and the world that I try to create in small ways is a world where everybody's needs are getting met all the time, including yours, including the leaders, including the people who are marginalized, including the people who are usually holding the whole world together with baling wire, and a place where pleasure is centered. And I mean the deep kind of pleasure that comes from knowing that everyone's needs are getting met, not just one person hoarding a whole bunch of stuff. And a world where we are so out of the habit of rigidity that when we're encountering for the first time something that doesn't fit into our mental or imaginary model, that we're soft and pliable enough to recognize it and to be able to allow it into the picture. And that means both things that we think are good and things that we think are bad, so that we don't spend 50 years going, oh, they couldn't possibly be such terrible people as to be doing that to our political system, and then wake up one day and discover that they are in fact doing that to our political system, whether that makes them terrible people or not. And we really needed to address that structural approach 45 years ago. So that softness allows us to be adaptable. And that's, I think, an important part of the model, because if we're not adaptable, then we can't make it better.
I don't know that I could say it any better than that. But what I was thinking about is that I try not to get too focused on the details, because I think that when we're busy visioning a thing that looks a specific way, I'm only looking through one set of eyes, if I'm lucky. So I try to focus on the feeling of connectedness, and the way that I know where to go is that I follow what feels connective, and I follow what feels like it has space to breathe. I liked how Reverend Leila talked about the softness. I think of that as space to breathe, space for us to take a second to decide whether something different is just something we haven't seen before or an existential threat. A place that feels like nervous systems that are not always so frayed that not being reactive is really, really hard and takes a lot of work. It feels like a morning in one of my partner's homes where I can know that there's a yogurt in the fridge if I'm hungry, and that somebody is gonna make breakfast eventually, and that none of us are too fussed about who does what or when, so long as when hunger happens, it is met with food. So long as when need happens, it is met with resource. Where the day or the life can take shape however it takes shape, and it can be beautiful if it's active and out in the world, or a book and a couch and some music, right? That shapes are not the thing that matters the most, but commitment to being together is the thing that matters the most. So I think that's where I'll leave that.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I feel like we had such an amazing conversation. I definitely want to take some time out to open it up to the audience to see if anybody had any questions for our lovely panelists. You can feel free to raise your hand, drop them in the chat, or come off of mute if you have any questions for the panelists. Yes, Jennifer, Kate.
My question is really kind of in the chat. I can read it, and it's how do we act against misogyny? For example, one of my former harassers that is in a white supremacist group also, I was not protected by, from this person, even though reporting not just, abuses against me, but against a Hispanic coworker. And I ended up having to leave the district. And he's still employed there. He was outed recently. I received a text with an attachment for an article calling him out, basically outing him as a white supremacist, and participating also in actions against people in Idaho at the Pride Festival, and also more remote areas in Washington State.
I don't have an immediate answer for your question, but I want to say that I'm really sorry that that happened. And I'm really sorry that the institution that should have been attending to your safety didn't do that. And I want to say that you deserved better, that the children who are part of that school system deserve a lot better, and that you're not alone, that we feel this with you, that we're here with you, and that this is a really hard thing to have any kind of good answer to, because of the opacity that has been created in a lot of structures, including many of our public school systems, that make it really hard to address things directly, that make it really hard to hold people accountable for even stuff that people will out loud agree is horrendous and unacceptable. The way that institutions of all kinds function to protect their own inside more than to protect the people who require protection is a major problem in not just American society, but like the global situation of being a person. I'm going to think a little more before I say anything else. Maybe Reverend Leila has something, maybe he doesn't. I don't know.
I do and I don't. And I just want to echo what Reverend Casey said about, I'm sorry that happened to you. And I'm sorry that the institutions that were supposed to take care of you didn't do that. I think I keep saying, this is like the 5th time I've said this week in public spaces, is I think the answers are collective. I don't think that I don't think any of us probably have good one-on-one individual kinds of answers for that question. The collective answer is a shift in culture. The collective answer is getting on the school board. The collective answer is that we have to act together to shift misogyny. And any one individual instance of it just becomes a space for continued harm, for continued injury, for continued stress. And so the urgency is ever present and growing for us to act together to change it.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. I see France has her hand up.
Hi. I find myself in the same way that recently there was the topic of anti-Semitism, and I found myself thinking, but wait, can't you not like one person and still not be anti-Semitic just because they're Jewish? And in this case, I find myself thinking a lot about the specifics of women and the specifics of men in the same situation. And it felt like it was the individuals that was the issue for me. So this is giving me a lot to think about. But I remember after my freshman year in college, I was working with the American Friends Service Committee at a Western State Hospital, big mental hospital. And I went into the men's wards, and the men's wards were very quiet, a lot of rocking, a lot of, real quiet. And then I went into the women's wards, and there was screaming and, running around and all kinds of real hyper uncomfortable energy. And I said something to the staff person about how very different those were and how I felt more comfortable in the men's wards. And she said, gender, the way we are raised in our gender, when we get mentally unstable, we tend to flip and be the opposite. So the nice, quiet woman suddenly becomes loud and abrasive, and the aggressive guy suddenly becomes very quiet. And I thought, whoa. And I put that memory with another memory, because I was Unitarian from my 3rd grade up until graduating from high school. And then I had a long break, and then I became Unitarian again. But in the meantime, the bulk of that time, I was part of the Sufi community. And at one point, my Sufi guide, who is probably a decade younger than me, so I'm 76. So at one point, she said to me, at a certain point, we women just don't have the patience for bullshit anymore. And we just want to say, cut to the point, and that can be seen as abrasive or, more difficult to deal with. And so I'm thinking about those 2 bits of information that I got in terms of, how we separate the individual person and the gender category.
May I add that it's been my experience that the educational system, whether we're talking about local schools or colleges and universities, are the least open to change. They are the most rigid in protecting the institution rather than the people in the institution. Why else are people still required to learn a language they'll never use, except that it's always been that way? In the example that you had given about the misogynist white supremacist and the school not doing, the district not doing anything about it, I would simply offer that, and unfortunately, the only example I can think of is male. It's a Goliath issue, that when you go to stand up against the school system and expect equal treatment or equity, you can't do it alone. You have to go and find support in organizations, ACLU, church, wherever, groups who fight these issues and who will support you can come together and lend their voice to yours, so that you're not the only voice talking about this person. And my experience has shown that when you do that, and when you go to the media, at least when things happen, it's now in the light. Even if things don't change, it's something people know, even if they're unable or unwilling to do anything about it. And if we shine enough light, maybe ultimately we'll get the changes that we deserve.
Thank you, Marta. I'm gonna give Leona a chance to ask her question.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate hearing from both of you. Your way of presenting yourselves shows me that you've done so much work to integrate within yourselves and understand things from a variety of perspectives, and have found places of graciousness and mercy in you. And I very much appreciate that way of being. And I want to ask something, and I don't want to put you on the spot or make this be too personal. I'm actually also a Unitarian Universalist community minister who is a psychotherapist. So I ask people questions all the time, and I get very used to having them be personal questions. And so I'm a little bit leery of asking my kind of question in this kind of place. But if you feel comfortable at all in speaking to any of this, I would love to hear about the way in which you have experienced the testimony of your own life as being a process of integration or rejection of something or acceptance of something, or how you have worked at making a pathway for yourself that has made sense to you.
There's a lot of potential answer there. One of the things that it feels really important for me to say is that I have been loved into possibility by a lot of people, most of whom were not my biological family. I have been held and cared for and encouraged to bloom by a wide variety of people, though I will say most of them, my queer chosen family and my queer elders, who have been making paths in spaces that make no sense for longer than I've been alive, and in ways that even includes Reverend Leila, who is not that much older than me, but older enough that that I in 1994 I didn't know a lot about myself at all because I was 6. So anyone who came out in the 90s is an elder to me in that way. I will say also that one of the pieces of luck that I've had, one of the things that's made it possible, is that though my family of origin wasn't a space that I made sense in, it was a space where people were very different from each other. And I spent much of my childhood trying really hard to figure out how my grandparents' 8 children wound up so very different from each other, as my mother and her siblings are, and how their children wound up the range of ways that I and my 30 plus first cousins are. That is a stroke of luck that I had to practice at home, being with people who weren't like me and seeing myself in people who I wasn't like, but who I was like. I will also say that getting to be with people in the context of abortion care, in the context of pastoral care, getting to do that learning, I think seeing other people being themselves taught me a lot, just observationally, about all of the ways that we cut a path through whatever sort of thick branches find themselves in front of us. There's so much that I could say, but I think that's the container I'm going to go with today.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful answer. Beautiful response. No such thing as answers, but you know how it is. Life is that way. And Reverend Leela, do you have something you would like to say?
I do. There's so, again, as Reverend Casey said, there's so much. I think probably each of us could write a one-person show on on our answer to this question. But I think the thing that has really been a kind of lifelong leitmotif for me is this experience of living in liminality. I think for a number of reasons, most of the people that I have met in my life are passing through borderlands. The border is a line that you step over. The border is not a place. It doesn't have depth or dimension. It's just a thing that you pass across in order to get from here to there. My father is from India, so I'm on the one side the child of an immigrant. On the other side, I'm from a white settler family that wagon trained across the country to California in the 1800s, and so I was born very literally into liminality, visible liminality that really irritates people. There are a lot of people for whom just that was angering, but it served me well as I grew up in Unitarian Universalism. My parents are both atheist. I grew from atheism to agnosticism and now theism, which is not the usual trajectory, but I don't usually take notes from the usual anything. And I spent most of my later childhood and young adulthood in agnosticism, which is another kind of liminality. And then my gender has turned out to be this other piece of liminality. And so I tell people that for me, the border has dimension. And some people pass through for a little longer, like they come in and set up a tent and they're like, oh, there's dimension here. Let me set up a tent. And then they're like, okay, I'm done. And they leave. I have like a house with a foundation and gardens, and it's like 3 stories tall and it's a Victorian, right? Like that's where I live. And I live inescapably and always in that space. I can visit sort of other places, but I'm never fully accepted in a woman's space, and I never have been, not even before my gender complexity became visible. I'm never wholly accepted in a white space. I'm never wholly accepted in a South Asian space. I'm never wholly accepted in other religious spaces because my religious concept is so complex. And so I have to seek out these tiny little nodules of community where things intersect. And often there's still some part of me that's left out of that particular intersection. So learning how to be whole in fractions.
Yeah. How to be whole in fractions. I love that. Yeah, that's a true process of integration, isn't it? How to be whole in fractions. Thank you both so very much. My heart goes out to you. And I hope we will be able to maintain contact after this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Liana. We'll take our last question from Brandy.
Hi. Cool. Sorry, all words are hard. So I mostly am just binary cis passing woman. I'm trans though. And I never know how people interpret my gender in a given space, and that gives me a lot of anxiety. Yeah, Night Out for Safety and Liberation. So yeah, that was I was chilling with Antoinette a couple of months back. But yeah, so I never know how people interpret my gender at any given moment, and that gives me a lot of anxiety. And I did explore, something more gender expansive until recently, when I had a lot of my facial hair just lasered off, just for my own personal safety and comfort, with the, return of overt fascism. And I don't know how to interact with UU spaces, and I kind of feel like UU spaces should be like spaces on easy mode for me. And there was a situation recently where a cis woman just came up to me and was just like, "Oh, hey, how about the genocide of those trans people?" And I'm like, this is like my second week at the church, and I was just like, yeah, how about that? That's some conversation starter. And I just walked away. And then the next week, she put her hand on me and was like, okay, that's a restriction of bodily autonomy right there. And I tried to talk about this with some people, and the path I chose to go about it was like just asking to speak from the pulpit. And I didn't put the onus on her, like trying to take this from a position of like, this person has harmed me and I want to bring hellfire and brimstone down upon her. It was something more like, let's imagine something kinder and gentler. And 48 hours before I was supposed to speak, after I'd spent like 40 hours on this sermon, I was told that I wasn't going to be speaking. Like, it was really hurtful, and I really felt like the whole thing was a big experience of gaslight, gatekeeping, girl boss. And I guess this is just like a microcosm of my experiences in UU spaces, where I feel like I go through the proper channels that I perceive are in place. And I read the bylaws, and I get told that things are a certain way, and I'm just like, then like, yeah. So basically my question is like, how am I supposed to interact in these spaces if even, the people who claim, the banner of feminism, and they don't even then, back that up with, the things they claim to support, and they wheel it back by saying, oh, we've already had a trans speaker, or sorry, I'm just.
You don't need to be sorry. Your feelings make a lot of sense. And they don't need to make sense because they're feelings and they're real, but they do make a lot of sense.
Brandy, I'm a Black woman in a very, very white church. But I've got to point out that UU is not a single entity. It's made up of many people, flawed people, because we're all flawed. And many do their best and fail. And every UU church I've ever visited is different. I shopped. I found the ones that worked for me because the people there were the people I needed. And the others that I visited had a different philosophy, or they were too stiff, or they were too high up on the economic scale. So I guess what I'm saying is, There may be a UU church for you, and there may not be. But it's not your fault. It's not about you. It's about those people who may not be able to live up to our principles or who are still working on becoming. But there are people who will care about you if you give them the chance, even when they make mistakes. I just want to reach out right now and hug you and tell you that as a woman who's been a UU probably since birth and didn't know it until I was in my 30s. Persevere, hon. Don't give up. Don't apologize. Keep going. You'll get there. I don't know when, I don't know where, I don't know how, but I did. And I think you will too.
Thank you, Marta. Like I said, it's not the mistakes that hurt. I'm fine with mistakes. It's the doubling and tripling down that hurts. And I'm trying my best with what I've got. And that particular UU space, I don't think it's for me, but I mean, it's fine. It is what it is. I'm finding other spaces, I think. And it's like what Reverend Leela said. It's that finding wholeness in the fractions. And that's what I've been learning. So
It's really heartbreaking when our people are unable to live into the principles that we claim. I was raised Unitarian Universalist, and I am still here basically because I am absolutely stubbornly refusing to let anyone tell me I don't belong here. But I did leave parish ministry. And I have left some other spaces, and there are spaces that I don't go into very often. Spaces I don't go into unless I have the energy to be armored. Spaces I don't go into unless I have the energy to be educational. And by educational, I mean educational with my own person in the way that all of us who are marginalized end up needing to be some of the time. And that's a protective choice. And it still breaks my heart, and it still makes me angry. And there are so many things that still absolutely rip me apart about the gap between who we know we can be and how we do not live that out. And I think, again, the answer is collective. I think that what we do to change our culture to bring us closer to our actual ideals is we work together, we call each other in and in and in and in, because when we do that, like again, like the situation with the school, we can't individually muster enough force to shift it. But when we collectively make an ongoing practice of helping each other be better Unitarian Universalists, of practicing actively Unitarian Universalism, I also have a whole soapbox about us needing conversion classes so that people actually know how to be Unitarian Universalists together, because we don't have them. And so people often come into our spaces injured and hurting and not skilled and unable to communicate about that in either direction. We need to give ourselves and each other the tools to be actively, transformatively Unitarian Universalists. That's where we're going to get better at that. And meanwhile, those of us who are more vulnerable to damage for one reason or another will choose our spaces more carefully, because that's what's healthy for us. It's not our job to allow ourselves to be beaten bloody, metaphorically or literally, while other people figure out how not to do that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything that Reverend Leela just said. And I think of myself, and this metaphor is complicated, but we'll go that way. I think of myself often as something like a tank, right? In the video game or role-playing game context, I can take a lot of damage. It's hard to get to my core. And so I try to go into communities and make a little more space for folks who are not by nature as tanky as I am, for folks who have been a little more beat up recently than I have. I get my ass kicked in public kind of a lot. Part of my job, they pay me for it. That's another conversation entirely. But you don't have to do that. I do it when I can and because I decide to. You don't have to do that. And I really want to encourage anyone who's feeling out of sync with their UU community, their local space, but especially for you, Brandy, if you can find a place that does feed you without getting your ass kicked occasionally or regularly, just sometimes the best bar, link in there. And sometimes that is not your local congregational space. If I remember correctly, I think I know that you live in a relatively geographically isolated place with only the one UU congregation, which I've actually been to a number of times. That is another thing entirely. And so I would really encourage you to check out some of our virtual spaces. I put a link in the chat to the information about the Uplift gatherings, which the UU Office of LGBTQ stuff puts on, and they are worship gatherings and pastoral space. Those are a real great resource. The Church of the Larger Fellowship, Antoinette is saying First U of LA online. I think that's a great option too. You've got a lot of options about places that you could connect with differently, especially because we all do, or most of us do, some kind of hybrid thing now. And maybe later, if you feel like filled up and grounded in those spaces, maybe you'll want to go back to this in-person space that's nearest by, and maybe you won't. That'll be their loss if you don't go back, not yours. So just like, please know that you're not alone. Please know that your choices aren't the congregation closest to you or none of us at all. Because I will say for myself, but I imagine I can say this for most people in this room, we want you here. I want to be in community with you. I can say that for myself. I want to be in community with you. And I hope that there is a space that feels right, that fits the needs you have right now, and feel welcomed to reach out to me. I am a person who exists and can be spoken to, as it turns out.
I want to thank both of you for being here, for being with us, for this amazing and vulnerable conversation around not just how we protect women kind of in a nebulous out there kind of way, but what really turned into a beautiful conversation about how we protect each other, even in this room. And I say room as Zoom space. And so I appreciate the ability to have such a compassionate way of looking at the lives of us in our UU spaces, online, in our communities outside of UU spaces. And thank you again, Reverend Leela and Reverend Casey, for coming in and holding this space with us and for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And so the last little bit of what I will do is I will remove all spotlights. And I'll put back up our slides from earlier just to show everyone who stayed on for a little bit longer what events are coming up for Women's Federation. And so everyone on this call and any other panel around addressing gender-based violence. Let's see if I can get back to my actual screen. Here it is. This was part 1 in our 3-part series, and our next part 2 will be on Thursday, October 12th. The best news is that everyone on this call has already registered for that by registering for this call. So you have the Zoom link already, and you might get a reminder email of the date when it comes closer to you. And the difference will be that the next panel will be the same questions, or somewhat the same questions, because what happened here was really beautiful, that the kind of questions got to morph with us in the conversation. But they will be asked of male religious professionals for our next panel. The following events are October monthly reads, our monthly community gatherings are very specifically open to women and gender expansive people. And those will be happening October 4th or October 1st and October 19th. And so if you haven't had a chance to sign up for our newsletter, or which is basically our email list. So I feel like everyone again is probably within that. If you got here, your email is in our system. So if you hadn't already signed up for our newsletter, you will be getting emails from us to keep you updated with events like this. And if you identify as a woman or a gender expansive person comfortable in women-centered spaces, you are able to join our online community, Mighty Networks. And I say that's kind of like a Facebook outside of Facebook. It's got chat and meetings and even smaller community groups that you're able to participate in. The book club read that we're having is The Sum of Us on October 1st. This book has been out for a couple of years, so some people have already read it, some people reading it this month. Just know that if you are free and available to come on the first Sunday, that it is great when everyone reads the book, and it's also good if you decide to pop in and you haven't read it, we will still include you in the conversation because these conversations are really important. And so we really appreciate everyone who's able to come and join us Sunday afternoon / evening to join the book club. Let's see if they're awesome. And last, for those of you who stayed on a little bit later, I'm so excited about that. Just our closing words. And I'm going to blow out my chalice. If you lit a chalice, it's a great time to extinguish it. Leader full means there is enough room for all of us. Seeing everyone roll in together is much more powerful than having 1 or 2 people speak for everyone. Thank you so much to the leaders who showed to kind of get this conversation rolling in the spaces of the UU Women's Federation as we continue our work in protecting women. Thank you so much. I hope everyone had a great evening. Take a minute to see people on gallery view if you hadn't had a chance to see all the folks that came and joined with you. So safe travels to everyone. Have a great night.
Yeah.